Okay, it's at this point, just when everything is going well for the Texas Revolution, that the Texas revolutionaries start to screw up. And what this speaks to is the lack of discipline. There's not a strong command and control at all of the Texas Revolutionary Army. It's really a citizens militia. There's various factions, power centers in the Texas Army. And Sam Houston, although technically he's in control, he's the commander in chief of the Texas Revolutionary Army. In reality, he has to run around and try to persuade people to accept his authority. So here's what happens. And now we're getting into the Chris book. And this podcast will give you some context for the Chris book. There's an event that some of y'all I'm sure had some excellent Texas history teachers. My daughter actually last year had a fantastic Texas history teacher at Pin Oak Middle School, if you know that school in Houston. Anyway, but most folks aren't aware of this event. And here's what happens. After the capture of San Antonio, the Texas Army, oddly, and remember, Sam Houston's not on the scene at this point in San Antonio, it starts marching towards Matamoros, which seems kind of crazy, right? It is crazy. It was crazy. So the Texas Army, instead of kind of training or trying to get organized or working with Sam Houston, the elements of the Texas Revolutionary Army that had been part, it wasn't the whole army, but the elements that had been part of the recapture of San Antonio, what they decided to do under the command of a guy named James Grant and Francis Johnson, I'm not going to test you on those two names, but anyway, under their leadership, the elements of the Texas Army that were in San Antonio start marching towards Matamoros. And what they're hoping is that by marching towards Matamoros, they can connect with other Mexican federalists in northeastern Mexico and stage a larger revolt against Santa Anna that included other Mexican states. This was the theory anyway. But the reality was much messier. Grant actually was he wanted Texas troops to go into Matamoros because he wanted to recapture land that he had lost in Coahuila. And that was his motive. We're not really sure what Johnson's motive was. So on the face of it, the action of the elements of the Texas Army going from San Antonio to Matamoros, beginning after the recapture of San Antonio in December 35, it's to unite various elements of Federalists in northeastern Mexico, but in some respect it was a land grab, especially on the part of Grant. Anyway, it was a stupid idea. Okay, let's just cut to the chase. It was really dumb. Because if you can visualize in your mind, okay, San Antonio, so the Texas troops that went into San Antonio, suddenly now they're heading southeast towards Matamoros at the exact moment that Santa Anna is marching an army of about 5,000 to 6,000 men from central Mexico through Laredo, through Eagle Pass, towards San Antonio. So the Texas Army in San Antonio is leaving San Antonio right as Santa Anna is beginning to march his men towards San Antonio. And so this is the Matamoros expedition. And this is how Chris kind of starts his book. He starts the book in a very personal way, but this is the beginning of the history in Chris' book, the so-called Matamoros expedition that is not really talked about much in Texas history, especially in the popular memory of the Texas Revolution, because frankly it was such a dumb move on the part of the Texans. So these folks, they march towards Goliad, the Texans in San Antonio, they march towards Goliad. And this is where Chris Brather begins his history of the Texas Revolution. He begins it with Sam Houston meeting up with this portion of the Texas Army marching towards Matamoros. I think it's near Refugio is where he meets with them ultimately, and begging them not to march to Matamoros and to march to join the other elements of his army in East Texas. So this is the context for Sam Houston being kind of in Southeast Texas, where this is, what is it called? Sam Houston's speechwriter. And as you'll see in Crisp, there's a lot of controversy about exactly what Santa Anna said to these troops uh, when he met up with them, I think in Refugio. And what Chris looks at the historical documentation, which for years had said that Sam Houston had said very racist things about the Mexican army at Refugio, and Chris disputes this. He disputes the historical sources of this, and so that's what the chapter Sam Houston's speechwriter is about in the Chris book. This is the larger context for Sam Houston and why he was where he was and why he gave the speech that's so controversial that Chris talks about. Now, I'm going to take another second to talk about CRISP. And, well, you know what? Maybe I'll do that in another podcast. Just to kind of sum up, the Texas Army that marches toward Refugio, Sam Houston convinces them to stop. Elements of that army remain in Goliad. Ultimately, they'll be captured by the Mexican army and executed on Good Friday, 1836. But the other parts of the Texas Army, they do join Sam Houston in East Texas. And then at the same time, Houston talks to Jim Bowie, who's an interesting figure that I'll talk about at some point, kind of the iconic Alamo character. Well, I'll talk about Jim Bowie right now. I've got time. Jim Bowie came from a Louisiana family. He had come into Texas after he had fomented a scheme to steal a bunch of land in Louisiana and Missouri. What Jim Bowie did is after the U.S. took over Louisiana, Jim Bowie forged some documents which seemed to show that the Spanish government had given huge amounts of land in Louisiana and Missouri to the Bowie family. And if he had been successful, he would have been one of the largest landowners in the United States. But the U.S. government land official in New Orleans was on to Jim Bowie almost immediately. He was on to the fraud almost immediately. It was quite easy for him to compare the signature of the Spanish government to the forged signature that was pretty poorly done by Jim Bowie. And Jim Bowie's claims were never honored at all. So ultimately, Jim Bowie comes across the Sabine River. He does what a lot of Anglos do in this period of Texas history. He marries into a very high status Tejano family, the Veramendi family. This was very common that Anglo males would marry into Tejano families. The Veramendi family had been in San Antonio for generations. It was a large land holding family. And so Jim Bowie gains huge status in Mexican Texas almost immediately through the marriage to his wife, to this a member of the Veramendi family. Her first name escapes me now. I'll mention it on Monday. So sadly, though, what happens is his wife and his children, Jim Bowie's children, die of cholera in a cholera epidemic. Very just before the Texas Revolution. So that's what Jim Bowie, that's the context of Jim Bowie. He's come over from Louisiana. He's kind of got a shady past. He'd actually helped, remember the whole thing with smuggling slaves from Galveston into Louisiana. Jim Bowie had been part of that scheme as well. He comes into Mexican Texas. gains a strong footing in Mexican Texas by marrying into the Veramendi family, a very high prestige landholding family in Mexican Texas. His wife and children die, and that's why he's on the spot. That's kind of his thumbnail sketch of his background. So Houston orders Bowie to go back to San Antonio and to basically abandon San Antonio because Houston doesn't think that San Antonio can be held. And Bowie goes back to San Antonio, but he disobeys Sam Houston. It just shows how little control Sam Houston had over his own army. Jim Bowie decides, no, San Antonio can be held. We've just recaptured it. We're going to hang in there. We're going to hang in there in San Antonio. We're not going to abandon it as Houston ordered us to. And I'll talk a lot more about what happened in San Antonio in a bit, either in another podcast or when I see you on Monday.